When I started woodworking, I fell in love with the process, taking a rough piece of lumber and turning it into something useful and beautiful. But as I started posting on social media and eventually here on YouTube, there's this added pressure that every project needs to top the last one and have some crazy wow factor. But sometimes I just want to make something simple just for the fun of it. So today, I have no plan. I haven't come up with a groundbreaking idea. There probably won't be a wow moment in the final reveal. And honestly, I have no idea what I'm gonna make. But I've got a couple hours, a stack of lumber, and an urge to build something. So let's see how this goes. I like to make these what I call creative reset projects from time to time in between my larger projects. I just usually don't fill them because they're not really that exciting, but they're usually made out of scrap wood. And the biggest problems I have with scrap wood are usually these cutoffs that are like short, but they're still like wide, thick chunks of wood that you can't make furniture out of it, but like you also can't throw it away because it's a nice piece of wood. And these thin strips. So I'm thinking maybe I'll make multiple things. I really don't know, but I'll just start going through all this stuff. Maybe I'll do something bent and curvy, or I'm really not sure. I'll just start collecting some useful chunks here and see what I got going on. All right, I got a good stack of chunks here. So a lot of these just need some work. These were like the cutoffs from when I made a circle from a dining table. So there are dominoes in here that I need to cut away, and I test edge profiles on these chunks also when I'm in the middle of projects. So I just have to clean them up a little bit and get them all to the same thickness. When you're building furniture, precision is everything. A bed has to fit a mattress just right. A table needs to be the correct height in order to sit comfortably. Built-ins have to fit perfectly in the spot where you're installing them. And then every part within those builds has to line up perfectly. What good is a nightstand if the drawer doesn't open smoothly? I absolutely love the challenge of those kinds of projects, but they're just that, challenging. So every once in a while, I really enjoy making things that don't require all that precision. No measuring twice, no perfectly cut lengths, just following my instincts and seeing what happens as I mess around in the shop. All these chunks are different widths, but I milled them down to the same thickness. Then I set up a stop block and cut them into smaller pieces, all the same length now. What size are they? I have no idea, and that's what makes this fun and relaxing for me. I figured the best way to use this material was to make an end grain board, so I started playing around with the layout, trying to make it look as random as possible. Then I labeled all the pieces so I could put them back together like this later. So doing these projects where there's minimal planning is really fun for me, but this is where it starts to get challenging. So if I would have planned out this project beforehand, I would have probably foreseen some issues, like I have to glue up these rows like this and clamping like this and making sure everything is going to be really straight is going to be a little bit difficult. So I had to try to figure out a way to get these to glue up straight. So I'm going to take a moment and figure something out. Okay, after a quick snack break, I figured something out. I realized the best way to keep all the rows of these bricks straight and aligned was to glue up each row individually. Then, as I put the rows together, I used straight edges between them to keep everything nice and even. Those straight edges, or cawls, are covered in packing tape so they aren't being glued to the bricks. They're just there to make sure the bricks are straight. I considered leaving them out and just gluing all these bricks together all at once, but that seemed like it would be super stressful. And remember, this project is about relaxing and having fun for me. And in case you didn't notice what I'm doing here, I'm gluing these in a way where the end grain is facing up. So right now, I'm only caring about getting a perfect glue seam on the edges of each piece. Whew, that was really not so bad at all. Hopefully nothing is like curving weirdly and I don't have to remove too much material to make everything flat, but I think that went okay. So while that dries, I was looking at my scrap bin again, and I found this piece over here that was a cutoff from the inside of a circle for a tray. And it got me thinking about making a board that has like a sunset on it or something. And then I found this, which was a board that I glued up last year when I was doing my holiday gift project, and I just ran out of time for finishing it. And I feel like this could be combined in some sort of way to make a really cool looking board. So I'm gonna try that now. All right, we're gonna get a little weird here. In my mind, that old glue up looked like it could be mountains. So now I'm just going to need some more pieces that could be the sky, particularly a sky at sunset. So I found some thin strips, like the strips that are usually cut away when milling rough lumber to size. Then I cut them all to the same length, cleaned up any roughness, and then glued them up in this sort of ombre pattern with the colors fading from light to dark. This glue roller that I'm using is actually 3D printed. It's a file that I found on MakerWorld, and I printed it on a brand new Bambu Lab machine that I'll talk about later. So it's been about a week since I clamped all this up because, well, life. But I'm happy that I had a little break to think about the next steps. I didn't really think about how I was going to level all this end grain after it was all glued up. But now that I had a pause mid-project to plan a little bit, I think I thought of something pretty cool. So I'll show you guys that when I get to that step. Show of hands. Who's got a project just sitting on the bench, half finished, and you just can't seem to find the time to wrap it up? Yeah, I feel you. Anyway, the strips turned out perfectly straight, and I was really happy with how everything was looking. My little sunset panel came together nicely too. Also, peeling the glue off my 3D printed glue roller, ridiculously satisfying. These strips just needed a bit of cleanup before I could glue them all together. They were already super straight and didn't need any leveling, but I ran them through the drum sander to clean off any glue squeeze out that might keep them from sitting flush. Now they're ready for glue up. It's a pretty straightforward process here. Since this is going to be an end grain board, I'm applying glue to all the faces now. I got to use that fun little 3D printed roller again, and then I flipped all the strips so the end grain is facing up. I set it aside to dry, hopefully just overnight this time, not for a whole week. While that dried, I could work on the Mountainscape sunset board. I sent both mountains and the sunset through the planer until both panels were cleaned up and the same thickness. Then double side tape the curved sun piece to the sunset panel and cut it at the bandsaw in such a way where the blade was slightly touching the walnut sun piece as it cut through the sunset panel. So there was a cut happening on both parts. After removing the double-sided tape, this fit pretty nicely. It just needed a bit of sanding on both parts to clean it up. Not too much sanding because I didn't want to change the shape, just a little. Earlier in the video, I said my other big scrap problem is thin strips. So I sent some through the drum sander to make them match the thickness of the bandsaw blade and put one between the walnut sun and the gradient sunset panel. Without this strip, there would be a pretty weird gap between the parts, and then I set that off to dry. Back at it for another day, and it's time to clean up this end grain. This could be a really challenging task, but I was scrolling through MakerWorld and found this slab flattening jig, and I set it off to print on my brand new Bambu Lab P2S printer. That's right, the iconic P series has been redefined. Unlike the P1S, the P2S features a 5-inch touchscreen that's super easy to navigate and a much improved internal camera with failure detection. So no more waking up to a spaghetti monster after an overnight print. There are tons of upgrades packed into this machine, but a few of my favorites so far are the quick swap nozzle and the new adaptive airflow system. It improves cooling efficiency and even lets you print with the door closed when working with low temperature filaments. With so many great machines in the Bambu Lab lineup, it can be tough to choose, but I think the P2S is the Goldilocks of the bunch. It strikes that perfect balance of advanced features, performance, and price. Right out of the box, it's beginner-friendly, but still powerful enough for experienced makers. With this machine, you get high-end reliability without the high-end price tag. And speaking of things with the high-end price tags, if you want to buy a slab flattening jig or kit, you'll likely spend a couple $100. When you have a 3D printer, it just costs about $5 worth of filament and about $20 worth of aluminum and screws. Using this jig was super easy. Since I know my workbench is flat, I just made sure the board was secure and then worked my way across the surface until everything was leveled out. If I had to change one thing for next time, I'd probably double stick tape a ledge or a stop to the edge of my bench, something that the jig could butt up against. This time I was using my body to keep the front end of the jig from falling off the bench, which worked, but honestly, a simple bar across the edge would have made things way easier and a little less awkward. I did 2 passes on each side, with each pass taking about 5 minutes, so the whole flattening process took around 20 minutes, which isn't bad at all. It does make a huge mess though, but this is a really effective way to flatten an end grain board. You'll notice some vertical lines following the path of the bit. They look like ridges, but they're not. It feels totally flat. It's just the way the end grain reacts when it's cut in 2 different directions from the spinning bit. Nothing sanding won't take care of. And now it's been another week since I put this in clamps. And I just let this sit here in my shop. It's just a very busy time for me in life in general, so I have not been able to work so much. Didn't really think much about the project during this week, so let's just get back to where I was. I know I'm jumping back and forth between these projects, but that's just the reality of how this whole process went. This is what happens when you don't really have a plan and you're just trying to make the best use out of the little shop time you have. Such is life. So far, this is looking really fun, and using a flush trim saw for me is also always super fun. Want to know what else is really fun? This 3D printed Bench Dog cam clamp, another file I found on MakerWorld. Now, this was probably the hardest part for me in this whole project, deciding how to draw the mountains. I finally just decided to commit to a line and make the cut. I used double-sided tape to attach both the sunset and mountains together, then cut them both at the same time at the bandsaw on the freehand line I drew out. After peeling them apart, I took pieces from each panel and they fit together really well. I also realized I could potentially make another board out of the scraps that were cut away from each panel. I sanded each part at the benchtop sander off camera very lightly, then glued them together using a thin strip in between them that's the size of the bandsaw blade to fill up the kerf cut between them. I didn't want to have to remove so much material after gluing this up because I didn't want the board to be any thinner, so I used these 3D printed joint bridges to keep both halves level with each other on both ends. A pack of 12 of these would cost you $60, but if you have a 3D printer, you can make 12 of them for just under $15. I also glued up the cutoffs from the main board to create what I'm going to call the bonus project. I didn't really care too much about this one at this point, so I just glued it up all willy-nilly without caring about anything being even. The next day, I could take those 2 panels out of clamps and finish up these projects. I really love having the ability to print these little accessories whenever I need them. Honestly, I didn't think I was going to use my 3D printer as much as I do, but at this point, I feel like I've saved thousands of dollars just printing what I need instead of buying it off the shelf. And I got to use that fun little cam clamp again to hold everything steady while I trimmed the strip flush. This board does not look like any of my typical projects that you've seen me do. It's very whimsical. And at this point, I'm not actually sure I like it yet, but I continued cleaning it up and then squared up the ends. In order to square the ends of this huge end grain board with the miter gauge, I needed to clamp on my infeed extension, which worked out great. And I wasn't cutting this to any specific measurement. I was just cutting it to be the widest it could possibly be when I cut off the jagged ends. Then I spent about 45 minutes at the drum sander, smoothing out all those marks left over from the router sled. Yep, even though the drum sander is the right tool for this job, it still takes a super long time because you have to take teeny tiny little passes to prevent burning, especially on this maple. All boards are flat and ready for final shaping now. I decided to have a little fun with my bonus project and cut a little handle into it at the bandsaw, and after that shape was sorted, I picked the radius for the corners on the other end using these 3D printed corner radius templates. I used that template just as a guide to freehand cut the corners and then bring everything to final shape at the benchtop sander. I drilled a hole in the handle at the drill press, then moved on to the sunset board. Using those 3D printed templates again, I picked which radius I wanted for the corners, rough cut them at the bandsaw, and then I perfected them with a flush trim bit at the router table. I've been using these templates on every build recently, so happy I printed out this whole set. Now for the handles on the sunset board. I figured out that I could use my draw pull jig with a bowl carving bit. I kind of wish that I named this jig something different, because I've been finding so many uses for it lately, and there were also a few people in my last video who tried to politely inform me that I spelt the word draw incorrectly. Anyway, I was so happy with how this little recess turned out, and I love how easy this process is to do. This bit is huge and a little intimidating to use with a trim router, so I just took small bites until the bearing on the bit hit the template to make the perfect little recessed handle for this board. All the boards get edge details now. A large roundover on the bonus board, a smaller roundover on the sunset board, and a very little chamfer on the end grain board. Now onto sanding. The drum sander is great, but when you're using lower grits, it tends to leave gouges in the surface. If I were batching out a bunch of boards, I probably would have taken the time to swap out the sandpaper for progressively higher grits on the drum sander to avoid that, but this is just one board, and luckily I've got a Rotex. Even with that though, it still took about 20 minutes per side to clean up all those gouges. But then it was smooth sailing from here on out as I made my way up the grits, which took me about 5 minutes per side per grit. I'm curious if you guys would be interested in a more depth sanding video where I go through my whole process in more detail. Sanding is super boring and I usually just gloss over it in all my videos, but it really is one of those steps that can make or break a project. So let me know. I went up to 220 here, then popped the grain with water to raise all the fuzzy bits, then sanded those fuzzy bits back down, and it was time for finish. I've been using a small plastic cutting board for years because I just couldn't bring myself to buy a super expensive end grain board knowing I could make one myself. But I never really had the time because I've been so focused on making projects that do well as YouTube videos. There's this huge disconnect between what people actually need or use in real life and what goes viral on social media. As a maker who also makes a living through content creation, that disconnect can be tough. You start chasing what performs well instead of what fulfills you creatively. But these simple projects, creative reset projects as I like to call them, are like a palate cleanser to remind myself why I started doing this in the first place. Besides for the fact that these projects are not viral worthy, I usually don't record the process of making them because sometimes I also need a break from being filmed. I just need to mess around in my shop by myself, making something without thinking about the clicks and views. But this time I decided to record it for anyone out there who's dealing with creative burnout, or for those who are struggling to get started because they feel like their ideas aren't special enough. Just make something. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be yours. I've been wanting a huge end grain board like this for years. I've made many for others, but I've never made one for myself. And I like the simplicity and the randomness in this pattern, and I think this was a great use of those chunky scrap cutoffs. Plus, it was fun to make. Now, the sunset board. Not quite how I imagined it in my head, but that's how these no planning, low stakes, experimental scrap projects go. And that's okay. Not every project needs to be the coolest thing you've ever made. At least I made a thing. I do love what I did for the handles though. Totally gonna implement that on more boards in the future. The best part of just messing around with scraps are the unexpected wins, like this bonus board. I think I actually like it better than the main sunset board, especially the detail going on in the handle. There's no way I could have planned out that pattern. It's just one of those happy surprises that happens during the shaping process. And I absolutely love it. So even though these projects are nothing special or viral worthy, I hope you enjoyed the process of making them. But more importantly, I hope it inspired you to just go out and make something. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.